All right, well, that's the bell, so let's go. Welcome to our webinar on fitting the new shape standards into high school phys ed. I'm Bill Bodie and recently retired from a 30-year career teaching in Charlotte, North Carolina. I taught 26 years of my career in the high school level, and the first school that I taught at only two high schools. One first high school is a very affluent high school. But the second one was a less traditional educational environment for my kids, and I learned a lot of my teaching strategies while teaching at this particular school. In 2017, I was awarded the Shape America High School PE Southern District Teacher of the Year. Didn't quite make it all the way, but I was fortunate enough to write high school PE curriculum for Goodheart-Willcox publisher, titled Fitness and Wellness Skills a few years later. And now I'm the Health and PE Content Specialist for GW. So let's get cranking into our agenda for today. And I tried to go a little different today. I wanted to kind of have an agenda that, you know, maybe pique your interest a little bit. And so most likely the heavy lifting is already done. We're going to get an aerial view of our new standards. Are we in English class? We're going to give ourselves a new title, Educational Engineer. And then finally, how do you know what they know? As we kind of walk through today, just keep those in mind, and hopefully that's piqued your interest. So let's get started. Most likely you have already done a lot of the heavy lifting, and simply stated, most of what you're already doing will fit into the standards. What I hope to accomplish today is to help guide you in seeing how they all fit together and possibly give you a few new thoughts to use along the way. I'm not here as I don't have a master's degree, I don't have a doctorate, but what I have is 30 years of experience. And I learned through those 30 years that the standards are really important, and how we break them down really does help kids. And it also establishes some credibility with our colleagues and also our administration. Let's start with this question. Which activities do you already teach? As you may notice, I have three columns of activities, and these columns aren't random. I took these from the new standards, and the activities I chose, they aren't limited to the ones that I put, but if you have a little Google search or an AI search, you're going to see a lot of these are going to pop up. And you're also going to see a lot of them that aren't there that we're accustomed to teaching, which is kind of the shift that we're making as a profession. The next set of questions I ask myself at the beginning of each semester. The answer to these questions are not difficult, but they are a key to overall planning, and they do change from class period to class period and semester to semester. As we begin to look at the new standards, we need to keep this in mind. Another reason to know these answers to these questions, it is to help advocate for optimal learning resources for our students. Administration may not know a lot about physical education, but they do know standards, and they do know that teachers and students need proper resources to meet those standards. If there are specific standards that cannot be met because of a lack of resources, I use these standards to advocate for those resources for my students. And it has helped me considerably throughout my career get the equipment, get the facilities that I needed for my kids to be successful. Let's get an aerial view of our standards. So real high level. Uh, and so as we go through this, what I'd like you to be able to do is check the standards that you're already meeting, right? What's that heavy lifting? Also, when you check those standards that you're already doing, I would get a copy of these standards and I would start marking them, whether it's a highlighter, whether it's put a check, some type of way that you know that I'm already meeting these standards, and that's going to reduce your workload. It's going to not make you as overwhelmed as you may think looking at all of these objectives. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing I would go is with a different highlighter or a different way of marking which ones need my attention. And so now that list is going to be a lot smaller. And so I know that some of the new things that I'm going to be adding is not as daunting, like I said before, right? Uh, and so do you remember those three columns of activities I had earlier? You're going to notice they are listed in the first three objectives here, followed by dance, the health and skill related fitness components, and then finally swimming. So now that we have that specific list to draw from as we plan out our course, maybe it's not as difficult as we think. The second standard, which is applies knowledge related to movement and fitness concepts, there are a couple things I'd like you to notice here that we have another set of objectives based on the activity categories in standard one. We're going to go deeper than just being able to demonstrate an activity, which we know as PE teachers. These verbs at the beginning of each objective is changing, and we'll discuss those verbs a little bit later in our presentation today. A first look at standard 3, which is develops social skills through movement. We see standards that help develop the whole child. As physical education teachers, we know the value of movement beyond just the physical. Communication, problem solving, safety, empathy, and more are covered in this standard. And later on, we're going to see how we can create these learning experiences and go beyond just hoping that our students will develop these throughout our course. Standard 4 develops personal skills, identifies personal benefits of movement, and chooses to engage in physical activity. This standard may really challenge us because we'll need to allow our students to have more of a voice in their learning experience. We become facilitators of the course, and students gain more control, which is where I believe the true shift happens to make all the other standards make sense to them. Are we in English class? Well, yes, we are. So here we're going to go and break down each standard by verb and provide some examples for how we can teach each objective and how students can practice them as well. So we're going to look at each standard again, except this time we're going to highlight and categorize the verbs along the way. Now, this may be a little bit of a different approach than what you've learned before and how to break down standards, but I found this was easiest for me. The simpler I could keep things, the better off I would be in helping my students meet these objectives. Standard 1 is pretty simple. The main verb in each objective is demonstrates. And I highlighted it in yellow because any verb I see that has to do with maybe a physical movement, I'm going to highlight in yellow. Also, these verbs are going to take more time for students to develop and will be used a lot throughout our course. As you can see here, I have a few other verbs that are yellow verbs, and this is how I categorize them. Along with demonstrates, we have applies, exhibits, and participates. And when I look at an objective and know all the variables we've discussed earlier about the resources and facilities, I ask myself 3 questions. How am I going to teach it? How are my students going to practice it? And how am I going to assess student learning? On this slide, the Teach It section is a general list of teaching strategies. The key here is you as the teacher need to allow students to implicitly learn what you want them to practice and ultimately be assessed on. And since this webinar is more about the standards, we can say best practices for teaching, best practices for students, and assessments for another time. But I did want to provide you with a few examples. And for here, teaching it, just viewing a movement demonstration or reading learning cues or even content. I think that's a shift I would like to see uh, secondary physical education make is add a little more content. And then practicing it, obviously we can do this stationary, we can do this with partners, and definitely want to benefit from small-sided game situations. The next few slides, we're going to see some different verbs highlighted in green, blue, and red. Each of these categories we will discuss a little more in depth soon. Here's some more yellow, red, blue, and green with standard 3. So just again, showing you an example of how I'm breaking down the standard using the verbs and then putting in verbs in categories. And then finally in standard 4, we have a pretty good mix of all of them. And now let's go ahead and look at the green verb, highlighted verbs, which are evaluates, analyzes, establishes, discusses, and reflects. Teaching these verbs, I have instruction and purposeful activities as examples. And one way my teaching evolved during my career is in order for me to be viewed more as a physical education teacher and less as a recess coordinator, or worse, a roll out the ball teacher, I needed to adopt some teaching strategies that mirrored those in core subjects. That was my personal growth, which not may be for everybody or may not be for everybody, but that's the choice that I wanted to make to earn the respect of my colleagues, administration, and give all students a quality learning experience. Student practice will show some of the philosophy changes as well. I have exit tickets, class discussions like think, pair, share, post-activity workout reflection can be incorporated during the lessons to give students the opportunity to process what I have taught and are for them to be able to articulate what it meant to them. And I think this is, again, it's a shift. It's going to require some time for folks to add that to their teaching. And it's something I just learned over the years that really benefited kids. Let's take a look back at slide 14, back a few slides, for an example. And so I'm going to look at the objective 2.12.5, analyzes how health and fitness will impact quality of life after high school. My thought here is this would be a standard I would address further down the road. My students would need to learn a good working definition of health, fitness, and the positive and negative consequences of physical activity over the lifespan. This doesn't have to happen in one class period. Personally, I'm going to spread it out over a week or two. And this goes against the PE philosophy that we need to keep students moving 90% of the time. I get that. But if I'm doing what's best for kids and I'm doing what I need for students to be able to meet my objectives, I had to use a variety of facilities. So I've used a classroom. I've used the library. I've used the cafeteria. I've even used the hallway. I use these different facilities in order to have classroom instruction, small group stations, online learning to help students gain the knowledge that they need for this. And if you look at most of the objectives highlighted in green, you will see this approach may help you not feel overwhelmed by thinking the standard needs to be fully taught and practiced all in one lesson, or maybe even 2 lessons. Let's spread it out to give our students plenty of time to learn. So moving to the verbs highlighted in blue, sets, develops, designs, implements, creates. Students are tasked with building. They're putting things together and using what they have already learned to create something of their own. And like the green verbs, this will need some prior knowledge for students to practice, which means teachers will need to provide some instruction along the way. I loved having purposeful activities. I love what we have social media is just a wealth of activities for physical education teachers. I love our community, but a little bit of a soapbox moment here. If those activities are just tossed in like, hey, I'm going to do this today because it looks really cool, we kind of lose the meaning there. Sometimes I wish when people would add those cool activities, maybe they would add the objective that they're meeting. So it gives some context to other teachers that this is a part of my overall plan, not just a cool activity I do to get kids moving. But that's me. But that's what I take out of a lot of movement is that's a cool activity. My kids would like it. How would I be able to implement that within the grand scheme of my course? Off the soapbox now. So we're looking at making sure that we look at all the standards. Let's look back at standard 3. Objective 3.12.4, which states implements and provides feedback to improve performance without prompting from the teacher. I chose this one so we can look at a new objective that increases the level of the level of difficulty by asking students to do something without prompting. We know that can be difficult, right? I'm thinking that this is something, the new standard, since I've retired, that I thought, you know what, I'm going to give it a shot of, from ground zero. So I would start with instruction on feedback and how we help others. And then I would discuss some scenarios my students would understand where feedback has helped someone else. And then for student practice, choose a partner or a group activity where the expectations are providing student feedback. So I would give something difficult, like maybe I would try juggling or maybe a new backyard game, meeting another standard from standard 1 that maybe my kids haven't been exposed to. So for me, my students have been exposed to a lot of Frisbee activities. And so I love disc golf. And to be able to teach students one of the more difficult throws, I could put them in that situation and they would be working towards one of the standard 1 objectives, but then also working on giving each other feedback based on the learning cues that I had given them. So keep on moving. And then the final set of verbs are highlighted in red. And these are, to me, decision-making objectives. Think, solves, encourages, supports, and chooses and selects. And again, the way I'm going to teach it is I'm going to have to instruct. I'm going to have to help kids process the information. So I have to give them some context and some content. I am going to use purposeful activities to do this. And we'll talk about more some activities that I use. And then practicing it, it definitely has to be ongoing. Students have to be able to, sometimes it can be hard for students to shift from just a play mentality in physical education to, oh, wow, I need to think. I do need to encourage. I do get the opportunity to choose and select, especially at the high school level. I feel like we really need to help our students see that these are skills that not only helps them in their physical literacy journey, but it also helps them in their human journey. So I chose objective 4.12.2, selects and participates in physical activities that meet the need for social interaction. I've experimented a lot with self-selected activities throughout my career because I did want to give students more of a choice. And you really have to be careful because there's a fine line between self-selected and roll out the ball. And so I would make sure that I would structure the time. And as we go into our examples, you'll see how I structured my time. I also structured the activities. I just didn't like, hey, you can do whatever you want today. Go look in the equipment closet, get whatever you want. Yeah, that was not my approach here. I really had to prime my students to be ready to do this. And we'll speak about this a little bit further in our time together. But now I'm going to give you a new title, educational engineer, because we're going to start putting some of these things together before we go to the assessment part. I'm going to put this in our chat if it'll let me, and it won't let me, but I'll get it there. But I have a playlist as the content specialist for GW and the author of Fitness and Wellness. I started off my school year, and man, this was way before SEL became SEL, with team building and fitness activities because I needed my kids to develop the skills that are now in standard 3. I needed them to develop those skills pretty quickly. And I found that team building and fitness activities was a great way to do that because I've got kids moving. I asked a lot of questions, which we'll talk about that when we get into our examples. And then I kind of stumbled upon this, but my kids started to make class agreements, which you and I know is rules and expectations. But I got tired of spending my first day or two, maybe even 3 days, going over rules and expectations. I felt I have high school students. They've heard it before. They know how to act. Let's allow them to create some of these classroom agreements. Again, I'm already starting to get them to select, choose uh, based on their own experiences. And I'm making it our class instead of my class. And when I put that in the chat, you'll see the videos really dive deeper into how I did that. And it also has some of the activities that we would do as well. And so I'm basically in the first week or two, I'm introducing all of the standard 3 objectives. Have they learned them all yet? No, but I've started. So next, we're going to look at the weekly planner broken down into 3 to 4 sections that allows structure for students, but it allows us flexibility as teachers in planning for each day of the week. And I do realize that schedules are different everywhere. So I did try to add some time frames that these activities can be accomplished. But I do know some classes are, 45, 50 minutes. I had block scheduling. And so I had a lot of time to be able to do this. So just keep in mind, this was my scenario for kind of what a week would look like. And so I'm going to start with Monday. And you're going to see we have 4 sections. Most of my career, like I said, we had block scheduling, so I had a lot of time. And if you have shorter classes, I would just either make sure I don't do this as long, or I just cut one out and put it in another day. But I like to use the same terminology with my students, so they'll become accustomed to the structure of the class. We'll always have a warm-up, but the type of activities will be different. And for this example, I'd start Monday out with a dynamic exercise warm-up to get students ready for the fitness workout. And here's where I need to make sure students know the why behind what we're doing. So instead of just telling them, hey, all right, we're doing, Frankensteins and knee ups and all the dynamic exercises. I could do that. And to be honest with you, I used to do that when I was younger, but I needed them to know why. And so depending on the class, I'd pose a question to get their brains warmed up before or after the physical warm-up. And for example, I'd ask, why do we warm up before a sports event or workout? And kids will give you a lot of answers, but most of the time it's like, so you don't get hurt. And I would say, well, that's exactly right. But how come I just didn't tell you to touch your toes and stretch your arms? And now I've led them into an example. We do dynamic exercises to get our blood flowing because we shouldn't stretch cold muscles, which is a common mistake that a lot of people make is stretching cold muscles. So I'm being able to teach about injury prevention which is the objective, without like, hey, today we're going to apply best practices for participating safely in physical activity. Yeah, kids don't want to hear that. But if I put it in terms that allow them to formulate based on their prior knowledge, yeah, we're learning. So next is the fitness workout time of class, and I can begin to cover several standards during this section. And we know that we can get the demonstration standards that relate to fitness, but I can find the other standards that are similar and can start to introduce them as well. And in my example, so we're working out, cardiovascular training, we know that we're going to get their heart rate up. And so I've looked through the standards and I've seen, you know what? A lot of my students think they're working out really hard. And from experience, I know that they're not. But I just can't tell them, hey, pick it up. So what I've done is we evaluate the perceived exertion. And so I'll have them put their hand on their chest or their hand on their neck and just offer a question. Hey, do you think your heart's beating faster, the same? Where do you think you're at? And so again, it gives them a little bit of a break, but now I'm starting to introduce rate of perceived exertion. And so I'm allowing them to just easily, just with their hands, figure that out, because I want them to start determining as we start working out, like, man, I'm not going as hard as I could be. Now, does that matter as much in class? Well, of course it does, but it matters more when they start working out on their own. Me personally, as an adult, when I work out, I know when I'm loafing it and I know when I'm going after it. And I don't need to take my pulse for that, which does allow me to introduce the next standard, which is applies heart rate concepts to ensure safety and maximize health-related fitness outcomes. And so now once I've had them in the middle of their workout be like, okay, yeah, I think I'm working out harder. Now I can give them that quantitative data. Well, let's take your pulse. And so I can teach them that. And so again, little by little, I'm introducing these standards in a way that they can understand and more importantly, make sense to them. All right, I'm going to go on the next ones, but we still got a couple more days of the week, so we can get there. So on Tuesday, you can see that we have a warm-up that is a team building activity to help develop Standard 3 standards, but it's still a warm-up. But I want to focus on the physical literacy activity. I introduced the activity on Monday, and the standards are the same. And we know learning takes time, so some standards would be covered over several consecutive days. And really, it's going to be throughout the unit of study. It's our job as teachers to give the practice they need to meet the standards, but also help them understand that what they're doing, even though it may feel repetitive, is a part of the learning process. So as we go into the last section, which is cool downs, and like the warm-up sections, the students will hear the same terminology, but the activities will vary. And cool downs are my opportunity to help students connect the dots to learning and actually cool down from the day's activities to increase flexibility and slowly lower the heart rate. And as you can see here, I can hit the green verbs a lot during the cool downs because beside it, you see I have exit tickets. Again, terminology that my colleagues use that in administration would understand. And so I put that in there just to kind of give you an idea of how I would close my day. Wednesday is a good example of how we can change up the activities, but keep the same structure. So notice in the warm-ups, we're going to add an objective on dance. I'm trying to meet the needs of all my kids. And boy, inevitably, I would have 3 or 4 kids that loved to dance. And when I was able to add this as a warm-up or a self-selected activity, man, they started to look at PE differently. The fitness workout, now we're going to change the focus to strength and endurance training, but we're still having students evaluate their intensity level. And if it's appropriate, I could add heart rate monitors if you have them, or use a heart rate app on their smartphones to check their heart rate. And that's a whole nother story of should we allow technology, should we not allow technology, being their phones. I never had a problem with it because, one, I told my kids, if you keep your smartphone on you while we're participating, it's probably going to fall out and you're going to shatter your screen. That solved a lot of problems. But I also told them, like, we are going to use them. You're going to be able to listen to music when you're doing self-selected activities. You're going to be able to listen to music when we're working out. You're going to use technology responsibly in my class. And as long as we do that, we're good. It's when we stop doing that that we'll have to make some adjustments. And high school kids are usually pretty good with that, at least the ones that I taught over the years. So as we get into Thursday, I'm going to reiterate some of the objectives, and I'm going to add one for the physical literacy activity section. And I'm choosing to tie in an objective on the historical and cultural roles of the activity that we're doing. And there's a lot of ways that I can do this. Like I told you before, I was able to have multiple learning environments for my students that I was able to advocate over the years. Well, if you don't have those, man, get a projector. Bring in a presentation. It's a short one. It's not long. It's a great time to give the kids a little rest, but reiterate the fact this is a physical education class. It's not a play class. I also used my LMS. I leveraged Google Classroom, Canvas during my career to use a flipped classroom model to where students would view some content, and then the next day we would come in and it would be a part of our discussion, or an exit ticket, or even a warm-up, just depending on where I wanted to put it within the lesson. Fridays were my assessment and self-selected days, and not necessarily every Friday, but students would know at the end of the week would be their opportunity to show me what they had learned, but also they knew it was a time to choose an activity that they wanted to participate in. And as we discussed earlier, this was not a roll out the ball time. It was based on class choice. And to give you a real quick glimpse of what I would do is, at the beginning of the year, I knew what equipment I would have, and I could put up the activities that they could choose from. I chose 3 activities because that's the space that I could accommodate, as well as the equipment. And so by doing that, they would vote on the 3 that would be their choice. And inevitably it tended to work out. I told them, hey, if there's something on the list that you can't do, or that's not there that you want to do, ask me. And my dance kids, I'm like, Mr. Bodie, all I need is my smartphone, and I'm going to dance. I was like, all right. And I could create some structure for them, or I would work with them to create some structure. And again, it allowed the kids who may not really excel in sports still feel like physical activity is a cool thing that they wanted to engage in. And ultimately, isn't that what we want to teach? Also could go from some standard 4 objectives and introduce some recreational and backyard games. So maybe I have stations to where students would have some cornhole, badminton, some of those activities could be spread out, and that's what we do. And so again, I'm meeting standard 1 and I'm meeting standard 4 by allowing them to select. So again, the standards aren't that hard. It's just how we put things together as the professional in the room. And speaking of student choice, once students have learned and developed a lot of the standards, 1 objectives, I begin to start turning over the reins and allowing the students to begin meeting the objectives that you see on the screen now. I would provide the structure to stay within the standard, but they get to begin designing or setting a goal. And during this process, it allows me to give feedback to help them establish that goal or design that plan and give them suggestions. Again, making it a collaborative effort makes it our class, not my class. So, final section we're going to go into is how do you know that they know? Evaluating student learning, aka assessing the students, and which evaluation tool to use for each of the 41 total objectives, in case you were counting. So we look at the first set, the yellow set, right? Demonstrates, applies, exhibits, participates. We're pretty, as PE teachers, we're pretty good at these. You know, we've got our skill assessments down. We know that we want our kids to give us demonstrations. We've learned to leverage technology so students can give us video clips or create GIFs. One thing that I used to do that I've always done as a former coach, I loved taking stats. So, you know, if I had a student who couldn't participate, I'd get them to take stats, or I would film. My kids love this. I would actually film activities that they were doing. So our small sided games or our regulation games, and I would take stats just like I would when I was coaching. And on occasion, we get kicked out of the gym, we could do a film day. My kids felt so special because we didn't have sports, a lot of sports at my school. And so for them to be able to like evaluate film, like, you know, their other, you know, friends who are athletes or college kids, they loved that. Just the engagement went through the roof when we started playing games because they knew they were being filmed and they were very conscious about, you know, making sure that they were doing the best they could because they knew we were going to watch. So that was always kind of cool. Another thing that I used for the standard one is I used a learning strategy from New Zealand. I can't remember how long I learned this, but shout out to Joe Bailey who introduced this at one of the conferences I was at, or one of the groups that I was with. But it's structure of observed learning outcomes. My high school kids love this, and I did adapt this to make it fit for my students. Again, that's a whole nother webinar. But if you've never looked at solo taxonomy, it can be a little overwhelming at first, but it really helps students pace themselves, right? And really look into what they're doing on purpose. Really love solo taxonomy. So that's my little plug there. And thanks again, Joe Bailey, for teaching me that. God, I don't know how long ago. She's not the creator of it, but she's the one that introduced it to me. So next, evaluation tools for my green verbs: evaluates, analyzes, establishes, discusses, and reflects. These are going to be written, folks. This is where you got to get your index cards or your quarter sheets, or get your technology, because I'm going to use these bell ringers. I'm going to use do nows, which again, that's the terminology my colleagues use. I want to make sure that they hear that terminology. But I'm going to do that in my warm-ups. My exit tickets are in my cool downs, like we talked about earlier. But another way that I assess this is if I'm doing like a true paper pencil test, which I put it on Google Forms, but I'm going to have open-ended questions on these formal assessments that are scenarios. And students get to analyze or evaluate based on the scenario. So it allows them to use that knowledge that they've learned and then give me and create an answer. And the other thing I used a lot of reflections. I really wanted kids to feel like they had a voice. And sometimes I can't hear 35, 40, 50 voices, but you know what? They can write it down. And it's quick, it's easy. I'm not like looking for, you know, a term paper. Some days I'm looking for 2 or 3 sentences. Some days I'm looking for a paragraph. Depending on the standard, maybe it's a page because it is an assessment. And so I definitely brought in some, again, other tools that my colleagues used. So if I'm looking at standard two, and we are, let me make sure I'm here yet. We're in the green verbs. That's what I thought. Analyzes how health and fitness will impact quality of life after high school. I'm creating a scenario for this, and giving them someone maybe in there, I'm going to probably go 20s, right? Because that's closest to their age. And put them in a scenario, they've just graduated college, they're in the workforce, and they're working 60 hours a week, and they've got a family at home. How do they make time for exercise? And if they don't, what could happen? And see, I've taught them all this before because I tell them that, lack of physical activity can lead to heart disease and can lead to diabetes, can lead to a lot of things that they don't have to be that major, but they lead. And so I want them to be able to analyze that. And that's how I would assess that. So our next set of verbs are blue verbs: sets, develops, designs, implements, and creates. Uh, I'm going to have written assignments here. These are the plans that my students are writing, and I need to get them to use their writing skills to write out plans. And I love projects. Sometimes we just don't give a lot of thought to having a project in physical education. But my projects, they spanned it in a certain amount of time, and I knew that when I look at some of the blue verbs, like creates or designs and implements a plan that applies knowledge of aerobic strength and endurance and flexibility, they need multiple opportunities to design. So when they implement and it doesn't quite work out the way they want to, I just teach them, go back to the drawing board and let's do it again. And so eventually they'll give me a final product that allows them to meet this objective. And then the last set of verbs, we've got thinks, solves, encourages, supports, identifies, and then chooses and selects. Again, I'm going to create written assessments with scenarios. I've used the team building activities so they've learned that problem solving is a part of physical education. It's a part of life. Encourages and supports. I'm going to have them write a reflection. So, if I'm using a scenario like, hey, so and so is having a difficult time with learning the overhand serve in volleyball or serving in badminton. I have a lot of kids that have problems with badminton serves. How would you encourage and support them? Or the reflection. Give me a time where someone in class has encouraged you or supported you through a difficult challenge that you had. And it's amazing how much we think we see as physical education teachers, but don't see. I've had some really powerful reflections about how other students have impacted them in their learning process. Love that because, again, it's our class. It's not my class. And then the chooses and selects. As I look here, I've got 4.12.2 selects and participates in physical activities that meet the need for social interaction. Like I said before, I did experiment a lot with self-selected activities throughout my career. I did not want to be viewed as a roll out the ball teacher. And so I used the solo taxonomy approach and really structured to where when kids got to choose their own activities, they were held accountable by making sure that they learned the skills, that they learned the rules, that they learned tactics and strategies. Oh yeah, that's all the way back in standard one too, isn't it? Right. So we're being able to, instead of just giving little blocks, all right, we're going to play this for a week. We're going to play this for 2 weeks. We're going to play this for a week. I found that frustrated kids. I also find that a lot of folks do that. If I'm being fully transparent, I moved to 6 to 9 week units with my framework to allow students to be able to learn an activity and really learn it, right? Really learn. Because it takes 20 hours to learn a skill, right? It takes uh, 10,000 hours to master it. So obviously, we're not going to master something, but if I want them to learn it, I do need to give them the time. I know I kind of jumped on the soapbox for just a second, but it was definitely a shift that I made in my career that made it easier on me. Um, and I found that my kids felt like they were able to learn. They had some choices in their learning, and it created a good culture within the class. And finally, uh, both my daughters love The Office, and so I use this meme. It's just that feeling when you make planning easier. The standards are they're new, and if you look at them in one big totality, it's a lot. But hopefully, I've showed you over the last 46 minutes that if we break them down into ways that we can best understand them. So for me, it was figuring out what I already do, highlighting the verbs, um, and then plugging them into my structure that I already have in place. I found that my planning was easier and I was able to accomplish more. My students were able to be more successful when I was able to do that. So, thank you. Thank you for continuing to teach. I know we have some other folks that aren't like in the classroom, but you affect education, and I think that's important. We all have our roles, and so if you have any questions or comments, um, please feel free to email me. I love feedback. I hope that this is has been worthwhile for your time because I know time is a commodity, especially at the high school level. We've got coaching responsibilities. Or if you're watching this on a recording, I do thank you for taking the time to just look at my perspective of the standards. Thank you, and I hope you have a great school year. Oh, thanks, Jen.